Sturgis Public Library. I do have a degree in history and degree in education, and I am on the board of directors for the old Fort Meade Museum. And I have a very much of an interest in history, and especially the soldiers from the Civil War until about the Spanish-American War. That time period is what I really like. And so who were these men? 8 Civil War veterans that settled in the Sturgis area. This presentation is a result of the library director, Chris Hahn, who was running around here a little bit ago, showing me a photograph and asking if I recognized any of the men in the photo. They are all identified on the back. I did some research and discovered that all 8 men were members of the Calvin Duke Post number 143 of the GAR in Sturgis, and are all buried here in Sturgis. Chris asked me if I'd be interested in doing a presentation on the photo, and here we are. To begin with, the GAR, or the Grand Army of the Republic, was a fraternal organization that was started by veterans of the Civil War. It was founded in 1866. The GAR became among the first organized advocacy groups in American politics, supporting voting rights for black veterans, promoting patriotic education, helping to make Memorial Day a national holiday, lobbying the United States Congress to establish regular veterans pensions, and supporting Republican political candidates. Its peak membership at 410,000 was in 1890, a high point of various Civil War commemorative and monument dedication ceremonies. According to the rules and regulations of the Grand Army of the Republic, all soldiers and sailors of the United States Army, Navy, or Marine Corps who served between April 12, 1861 and April 15, 1865 in the war for the suppression of the rebellion, and those having been honorably discharged therefrom after such service, and of such state regiments as were called into active service and subject to the orders of the U.S. General Officers, between the dates mentioned, shall be eligible to membership in the Grand Army of the Republic. No person shall be eligible to membership who has at any time borne arms against the United States. In Sturgis and Fort Meade, there were 3 GAR posts. The first was the Jack G. Sturgis Post number 47 at Fort Meade, established in 1884, with the last record of that post in September of 1888. The second was the Abe Lincoln Post number 48 here in Sturgis, established in 1884, and it existed for a couple of years. I couldn't find a definite ending date for that post. The Calvin Duke Post number 143 was formed in Sturgis in 1888, made up of members of the previous Abe Lincoln Post. And here we've got the banner from that's on display out at the Fort Meade Museum of the Calvin Duke GAR Post. Now, who was Calvin Duke? Calvin Duke was a member of the Jack G. Sturgis Post that had passed away. So they named the new post here in Sturgis after him. The last record of the Calvin Duke Post was December 31st, 1912, with 10 members and the following men listed as officers. The post commander, M.M. Baird. Senior vice commander, Marshal Hughes. Quartermaster, John Fay. Adjutant, J.D. Sadler. Chaplain, T.G. Cook. The last 4 Civil War veterans living in Sturgis were Marshal Hughes, Marcus Baird, Nathaniel Loop, and Samuel Weaver. I was able to identify them in the photograph as GAR members based on what they were wearing. The GAR uniform was a double-breasted dark blue coat with brawn buttons and a wide-brimmed slouch felt hat with golden wreath insignia and cord. A bronze star badge hung from a small chiffon flag. The star in relief depicted a soldier and sailor clasping hands in front of a figure of liberty. Members wore these insignia in their lapels so they could be easily identified. And here we have one of the GAR ribbons that they would have worn. The photograph was taken by O.A. Vick. He purchased a photography studio here in Sturgis in 1908 from May Stillwell. And knowing the date of the first man in the photograph that passed away, the photograph is taken sometime between 1908 and 1912. I have not been able to determine any closer to the date of the photograph, but looking at things that are going on in the picture, I'm assuming it's probably Memorial Day, because for the Civil War veterans, Memorial Day was the big holiday for them that they celebrated. The information about these gentlemen came from the following internet sources: Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, Newspapers.com, and Foldtree.com, as well as numerous sites regarding military regiments. I also looked at the Sturgis Weekly Advertiser and the Sturgis Record that we have here in the library, in case you're interested in old newspapers. There are some gaps in the histories of these men. The 1890 census was mostly destroyed due to a fire. However, there was a veteran census of that year that portions exist, and Sturgis is one of those portions. For some of the men, I was unable to find any information prior to the Civil War. Even though these men served in different regiments during the Civil War, we will see that some of them fought in the same battles. And two of them served in the same regiment and the same company at the same time after the war. The first gentleman in the front row is John Fay, the one on the left. John was born in Ireland on November 1st, 1842. He immigrated to the United States as a boy with his family. He served as a private in Company G of the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry from January of 1864 to October of 1865. According to his military records, he was wounded in the neck while on picket at City Point, Virginia, May 24th, 1864. Taken prisoner in a skirmish with the enemy near Unionville, Virginia, December 19th, 1864, and paroled the same day. Parole not recognized by General Shepley. Now, why wouldn't he recognize the parole? Well, at the time, a soldier during the Civil War, if you were captured and were paroled, it meant that you were supposed to go home and wait until you were exchanged for a soldier from the other side. General Shipley didn't acknowledge that he was to be paroled and just put him right back in the line. So they didn't follow the rules. According to his obituary, John served 5 years in the 7th Cavalry during the Sioux Indian Campaign. Well, I found a record of his service in Company A of the 7th Cavalry, but it was from 1867 to 1871. So John served under George Custer and would have been at the Battle of the Washita in 1868, but there's no record of his involvement in any engagement against the Sioux. John married Isabel Scott in 1873 in Louisville, Kentucky. According to his obituary, John and Isabel had 6 sons and 3 daughters. It also states that John came to the hills in 1877 and always made Sturgis his home. In the 1880 census, John and Isabel were living at Fort Meade, and John's occupation was listed as a clerk in a store. The 1890 and 1900 census showed John living in Sturgis with an occupation in 1900 as a house carpenter. The 1905 census found him still living here in Sturgis, and John's occupation was a bartender. In 1901, John was a salesman in a retail store. John died suddenly on August 6, 1918, at the home of his daughter in Billings, Montana. His death was caused by an acute attack of bowel trouble and had been ailing for but a few hours. The funeral was held at St. Martin's Chapel, and the chapel was crowded to its utmost capacity by sorrowing friends of the deceased. Burial was in the Catholic cemetery in Sturgis. Among the pallbearers were Marshall Hughes and N.H. Loop, whom we will soon meet. And all the photographs of the headstones that I'm showing were ones that I took just last summer here in Sturgis. The man in the middle of the front row is Bailey Madison. Lepanis Bailey Madison was born in New York, March 24th, 1833. Sometime prior to 1855, Bailey dropped the Lepanis. Bailey is first located in the 1850 census, living in Gilboa, New York. He's also there in the 1855 census, but there's no occupation listed for him in either census. 1857 found Bailey in Faribault, Minnesota, and his occupation was a constable. The 1860 census had him living in Winnebago City, Minnesota, with the occupation of a carpenter. Bailey enlisted in Company D of the 6th Minnesota Infantry in August of 1862 and served as a private and corporal until discharged in August of 1865. Many men in Minnesota enlisted at that time as a response to the Dakota Uprising that had started that August. The 6th Minnesota Infantry spent much of the early war in the Northwest fighting the Dakota Indians rather than participating in the battles with the Confederacy. They were part of the Sibley Expedition of 1863 into Dakota Territory. In 1864, the regiment was sent south to Arkansas. One veteran after the war wrote, "The utter recklessness and monstrous outrage of sending an unclimated northern regiment in splendid condition to do useful service on the Potomac or in any other part of the field in midsummer to such a malaria-stricken, disease-fostering hole as Helena, Arkansas, was soon manifest." The report of the Adjutant General for Minnesota for 1864 says, "Its ranks were full when the 6th Regiment arrived at that southern pest hole. But soon reports reached us relating with what fearful rapidity the flower of our young state was stricken down by malarial diseases. The report for the month of September showed but 140 men for duty. Many had died, others too sick to be removed were not expected to recover, while 461 had been sent to northern hospitals." The regiment was sent north to St. Louis and remained there until March 1865, when they were sent south again, this time to New Orleans. After the war, Bailey returned back to Winnebago City, Minnesota. He was living there according to the 1870 census. In 1873 and 1874, Bailey was sergeant-at-arms for the Minnesota legislature. In the 1875 Minnesota census, Bailey had moved to Stillwater, Minnesota. Sometime prior to 1883, Bailey had moved to Dakota Territory. The Sturgis record of September 7th, 1883, has a notice that he has mail waiting for him in Sturgis. However, the 1885 census has Bailey, single, living in Butte County as a stock trader. The 1890, 1900, and 1905 census all have Bailey not married and living in Sturgis. On April 21st, 1909, in Rapid City, Bailey married Mary Allen from Winnebago, Minnesota. Bailey was 76 and Mary was 68. Mary had been a widow for 5 years when she married Bailey. I wonder what the connection was between Bailey and Mary, because they both had lived in Winnebago, Minnesota. Bailey was an enumerator for the 1900 census. He was also involved in local politics, and in 1902 was elected as Justice of the Peace for Meade County. Bailey died April 18, 1913, and according to his obituary, he had been in poor health for some time and was an honored and highly esteemed citizen. He will be especially missed on Decoration Day as he has been for many years very active and prominent in promoting the success of memorial exercises. The funeral was held in his home, and he was buried in the Bearview Cemetery. Among the pallbearers were John Fay and Marshall Hughes. The last man in the front row is Fred Eckert. Fred was born in Germany on June 15, 1836, and came to the United States in either 1859 or 1860, depending on which records you look at. One says 59, one says 60. Fred was a private in Company F of the 21st Pennsylvania Infantry, which was a 3-month regiment that served from April 20th to August 9th, 1861. Then he was a private in Company K of the 5th U.S. Cavalry from August 12th, 1861 to April 4th, 1865. Fred has the earliest connection to the area. George Custer was a second lieutenant with Company G of the 5th U.S. Cavalry when Fred enlisted. The 5th Cavalry fought in numerous battles during the Civil War, including the Battle of Antietam. At the Battle of Gaines Mill in June 1862, the regiment lost 55 of its 237 troopers when it launched a mounted charge in an attempt to save artillery from Confederate troops. It also fought and is honored by a monument at Gettysburg. Most of these battles Fred was involved in. After a few years as a civilian, Fred decided to re-enlist in the Army. In 1869, Fred re-enlisted in the 5th Cavalry, and then transferred to the 7th Cavalry. So not only was Fred in the same regiment as Custer at the beginning of the Civil War, he also served under him when he was in Company A of the 7th Cavalry from 1869 to 1874. Fred served as a bugler and was part of the Yellowstone expedition of 1873. Fred was discharged in May of 1874 at Fort Lincoln, Dakota Territory, now North Dakota. So he wasn't part of the Black Hills expedition. He got out just before they left. Fred farmed in near Bismarck until he moved to the Sturgis area. The 1880 census has Fred living along Bear Butte Creek with his wife Catherine. His occupation was a farmer. In 1884, Fred became a trustee at a Catholic preaching station on Spring Creek. Also in 1884, Fred helped a German family living in Dickinson move to the area. I don't know who the family was, that was just a newspaper article that I came across. Catherine died in January of 1899. According to the 1890 Veterans Census, Fred was living in Volunteer, South Dakota, and was recorded as being hurt thrown from a horse and suffering with chronic rheumatism. The 1900 census has Fred still living along Bearview Creek with his wife Melissa, a widow who had 8 children. By 1905, Fred was again widowed. 1910 found Fred living at the State Soldiers Home in Hot Springs. Fred was chosen as one of the Civil War veterans from South Dakota to attend the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1913. Fred died at the Soldiers Home on December 18, 1926, and was buried in the Catholic Cemetery in Sturgis next to his first wife, who had preceded him many years ago. One note about Fred. His service record is with the 5th U.S. Cavalry, but his headstone reads the 21st, Company F, the 21st Pennsylvania Infantry, and the 1915 census says the 61st Pennsylvania. Now we move to the back row. The gentleman on the left is David Crockett Comstock. David was born April 7, 1842 in Illinois. According to his headstone and GAR records, he served in Company M, 2nd Illinois Light Artillery from 1862 to 1865. According to the roster of the 2nd Illinois Light Artillery, there is no listing for David Comstock. There is a pension index card for David Comstock that has him listed as serving in the 2nd Illinois Light Artillery. It also has him listed as a member of Company F, 36th U.S. Infantry, Company F, 18th U.S. Infantry, Company I, 15th U.S. Infantry, and Company D, 5th U.S. Infantry. The pension record index card lists David Comstock, alias John J. Dunn. John J. Dunn is listed in the roster of the 2nd Illinois Light Artillery. David Comstock stated in his pension application that he enlisted as John Dunn because he tried under his own name and was refused. Well, research that I've done this past week, I discovered while I was reading more of his pension file, according to two of his witnesses for his pension, when he enlisted in the 2nd Illinois Light Artillery, he had come from Bridgewell Jail. So I wonder if maybe he was known as David Comstock as somewhat of a scoundrel, and the people doing the enlisting wouldn't take him, so he went to a neighboring one and signed up under an alias. Don't know. More research needs to be done. I did find John Dunn on the roster of the 18th, 15th, and 5th Infantry. However, he was listed as a deserter from the 18th and the 15th Infantry and discharged from the 5th on January 1st, 1874 at Fort Dodge, Kansas by Special Order 235, dated December 23rd, 1873. In 1874, however, the record of this discharge is canceled, having been made on a forged special order. David stated that he knew nothing about the forged special order. That was in his affidavit, in his pension. David is the earliest of these men to come to the Black Hills. David stated in his pension affidavit that he was a teamster with the 1875 Black Hills expedition under Professor Jenny. So the Newton-Jenny expedition, he was a teamster with them. And if you know anything about the Newton-Jenny expedition, one of the other well-known characters that claimed to have been part of that expedition was Calamity Jane. So maybe David Comstock with Calamity Jane. There is an ad in the Black Hills Champion newspaper, which is out of Deadwood. This is from October 1877 for a boarding house in Deadwood operated by D.C. Comstock. David states that he moved to Sturgis in 1879 and lived there since. According to the 1880 census, he was married and living in Sturgis. His wife was Martha, also known as Maddie, who died in 1895 and is buried in the Bear Butte Cemetery. Her obituary listed 4 children, 3 of whom were at her side. However, in the 1880 census, there are no children listed for David and Betty Comstock. The name Betty was probably a misunderstanding of her name. The 1880s found David as a businessman in Sturgis. David had a number of businesses, including brickmaker and real estate. In fact, there is a part of Sturgis known as the Comstock Addition. Where it's at is over where the Senex is, where the Shopko used to be, Sturgis Coffee over in there, that's the Comstock Addition that David Comstock developed. However, David seems to have had business turnarounds. He bought the Keystone Restaurant in October 1885, but in April of 1888, the restaurant building was for rent. In December of 1889, the newspaper printed a foreclosure notice for David and Martha Comstock regarding property in the Sturgis area and part of the Comstock Addition. David was involved in local politics, elected in 1889 as a Republican for alderman in Sturgis. He did not run for re-election for that office. In 1890, at the County Independent Convention, his name was placed in the running for commissioner for the Sturgis ward. But, quote, R.S. Ho made a kick and D.C. Comstock withdrew his name. The 1900 census has his occupation listed as a day laborer. David married Rebecca Weber, a widow with 4 children, in 1901. Rebecca died in 1905, leaving David with a 12 and a 14-year-old. In David's pension application in 1905, he stated that he was working as a janitor at the county courthouse. Quite a change from having quite a bit of real estate property to being a janitor. He married Lenora E. Krauser Howell on March 18, 1981, and she had a number of children as well. According to the 1910 census, David and Lenora Krauser were neighbors. David remained an active member of the Calvin Duke Post of the GAR until his death on July 5th, 1912. He is buried in the Fairview Cemetery. The next man is James D. Sadler. James was born in Ontario, Canada on August 18, 1843. He served in the 11th U.S. Infantry from 1864 to 1866, reaching the rank of orderly or first sergeant. During the war years, James was in the 11th Infantry. It was involved in battles around Richmond, Virginia, including the Second Battle of Petersburg. In 1866, James was on duty at Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. In 1867, James requested to be appointed as a hospital steward with the U.S. Army. He states in his application that he had served 3 years as a hospital steward in the British Army. I could find no record of his service in the British Army. And thinking about it, if he enlisted in 1864 and was born in 1843, that means he was 21 when he enlisted in the U.S. Army. If he had been a hospital steward in the British Army for 3 years, that meant that if he'd done that immediately before joining the U.S. Army, he was 18 when he did that, if not earlier. Now, what did a hospital steward do, just to give you an idea? A hospital steward was responsible for assisting the surgeon in minor procedures, dispensing medicine, and supervising the attendants and other civilians who worked in the hospital. At a post like Fort Meade, the hospital steward was in charge of the hospital. He was the second highest ranking non-commissioned officer on the post, behind the sergeant major. So I really can't see an 18-year-old being in that position of responsibility. But that's what he claims. That's what he says right in his application. He was appointed hospital steward in 1867, and his first duty was in Richmond, Virginia. He remained in Virginia until 1870, when he came to when he was assigned to Dakota Territory. He served most of the rest of his career in Dakota Territory, except for 2 years in New York. Some of the posts in Dakota Territory that he was stationed at were Fort Randall, Fort Seward, Fort Yates, and Fort Meade. He was transferred from Fort Yates to Fort Meade in November 1888 and retired there in November 1892 after serving almost 30 years in the Army, 25 as a hospital steward. James married Ida Melton in 1866, and they had no children. In 1883, James applied for and was granted U.S. citizenship. They lived in Sturgis until James died May 5th, 1913. Among the pallbearers at his funeral were M.M. Baird, N.H. Loop, John Fay, and Marshall Hughes. You notice something here? Same guys are showing up all the time. The Sturgis Record, in an article in 1892, reports that hospital steward J.D. Sadler of Fort Meade has, without exception, the finest collection of Indian relics and curios in the United States. The article also states There hangs the stone pipe of Sitting Bull, not the imitation pipe that decorates every dime museum in the country, but the pipe that the chief himself smoked and gave to Sadler with his own hands. James Sadler is mentioned in a 2010 Cowan's auction of American Indian and Western art regarding the Sioux Catamite pipe with Sitting Bull provenance. From the auction website, included is a typed affidavit dated December 8, 1933, which states, "I hereby certify that this pipe is the genuine Sitting Bull peace pipe and was obtained by hospital steward James D. Sadler, USA, who served for 30 years in the United States Army from July 14, 1864 until November 29, 1892, when he retired from actual service, and at his death on May 5, 1913, he left the said pipe to me. Signed, Charles E. Nichols in Tama, Cooper, South Dakota." The 1910 census shows that James Sadler and Charles Nichols were neighbors living in Sturgis, Ward 1, Meade County, South Dakota. James' obituary mentions a niece, Mrs. Nichols, with whom Mrs. Sadler will be making her home. So, I'm assuming that Charles Nichols was the nephew by marriage of Mrs. Sadler, and that's how he acquired the pipe. The next man is Marshall Hughes. Marshall was born December 6, 1844 in Ohio. He enlisted in Company G, the 25th Missouri Infantry in 1862 at the age of 17 in Omaha, Nebraska. The military paperwork has his residence and enlistment as Fremont, Nebraska Territory. The 25th Missouri was engaged at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 and was involved in building fortifications in Mississippi until ordered to Missouri. They operated against guerrillas in northwestern Missouri. They were consolidated with another regiment in 1864 to form the 1st Regiment Missouri Volunteer Engineers. At that time, Marshall was remustered in as a veteran volunteer into the 1st Missouri Engineers. Those engineers were involved in Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia and South Carolina. In 1865, he re-enlisted. And according to his son's obituary, Marshall moved from Missouri to Nebraska in 1874 after the death of his wife, Sally. His son Leonard was born in 1869 in Missouri and was living in North Bend, Nebraska with his grandfather Isaac Hughes in 1880. The 1880 census has Marshall living in Neely, Nebraska. However, Marshall's obituary states that he came to the Black Hills in 1876. And there's a book that was published in 1889 that has a roster of the members of the 25th Missouri Infantry, and it has Marshall living in Omaha, Nebraska. So where he was during those years, I haven't found. Sometime prior to 1900, Marshall moved to Sturgis, because he's in the 1900 census here in Sturgis. And he remained a bachelor until his death, June 3rd, 1924. He was buried in Sturgis, and at the grave, M.M. Baird and N.H. Loop gave the GAR burial service. The next man is Nathaniel Harrison Loop. Nathaniel is another man that has an early connection to the area. He was born June 8, 1840 in Lockport, Niagara County, New York. According to a family history, in his teens he went to sea as a cabin boy. He learned to read, write, and figure from the ship's carpenter. In 1860, Nathaniel lived in Michigan prior to the Civil War and enlisted in the 6th Michigan Cavalry in 1862 and served until 1865. The 6th Michigan Cavalry became part of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, commanded by General George A. Custer, shortly before the Battle of Gettysburg. So another soldier that had a connection with Custer. This is a monument to the Michigan Cavalry Brigade at Gettysburg. It's located on the East Cavalry Battlefield, and this is what it states on there. This monument marks the field where the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, under its gallant leader, General George A. Custer, rendered signal and distinguished service in assisting to defeat the further advance of a numerically superior force under the Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart, which in conjunction with Pickett's charge upon the center, attempted to turn the right flank of the Union Army at that critical hour of conflict upon the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863. Nathaniel married Alice Dresser in Michigan in December 1865 when he was 25 years old. Alice died in March of 1866 of tuberculosis. He then married Mary Isabel, or Belle, Short, in Greenfield, Iowa on June 4th, 1876, when he was 35 years old. They had 5 children. Again, according to the family history, Nathaniel came to the Black Hills of South Dakota in April of 1877. In order to lighten his load of carpentry tools, he brought just the blades of his planes and made wooden handles after he arrived. He built a log cabin in Deadwood with a stone fireplace. Bell joined him in Deadwood in December of 1877. In 1880, Nathaniel and Bell and their son Guy were living in Deadwood. According to the census report of June 17, 1880, they were living on Sherman Street. The census report of June 20th, 1880, has them living on Cleveland Street. So in the course of 3 days, they moved. By 1884, the family moved to Sturgis, where he was a carpenter and a cabinet maker. He helped build many homes, buildings, caskets, etc. in the Black Hills. According to the family history, he said he was in demand because he knew how to build stairs that would fit evenly in the space available. In the November 15, 1888 issue of the Sturgis Advertiser, the following was reported, quote, N.H. Loop, a Scooptown Democrat, attended Jim Patterson's big dance Friday night, and as a consequence has been sick ever since. We don't think a Democrat would enthuse to that extent over the election of Harrison, end quote, referring to the 1888 election of Republican Benjamin Harrison. In 1890, he ran as an independent for sheriff of Meade County and ended up third of 3 candidates. Not surprising, as he was running as an independent candidate in a strong Republican county. Nathaniel Harrison Loop died January 29, 1930 at the Soldiers' Home in Hot Springs and was buried in the Bear Butte Cemetery. He was the second to last survivor of the Calvin Duke Post 143, the GAR. The last man is Marcus Baird. I received a majority of the information on Marcus from his great-great-granddaughter, Terry.
Just one great.
Just one great, okay. And Terry's here today. She shared quite a bit with me, and I thank you for the information. Marcus Merritt Baird was born February 10th, 1847 in Middlefield, Ohio. In 1851, he and his family moved to Indiana. He served in the 42nd Indiana Infantry and the 87th Indiana Infantry during the Civil War. The 87th Indiana was part of Sherman's March to the Sea. They marched with Sherman through South Carolina. They covered 425 miles in 50 days, only 10 of which were given to rest. During the war, according to family history, Marcus injured right foot by accidentally dropping the butt of his rifle on it, causing permanent injury while hurriedly preparing to go on guard duty. After the war, Marcus married Maria A. Philly, March 3rd, 1867, and had 8 children. In 1874, Marcus and Maria moved to Nebraska. Between 1876 and 1879, Marcus made many trips to the Black Hills and finally moved his family to Dakota Territory in 1879. According to a newspaper account, Marcus was one of the men who went out to get the body of Preacher Smith and was the first to find the murdered Wagner family near Bear Butte. The 1880 census has them living on Spring Creek and Belfouche River in Lawrence, later to be Meade County. Marcus's occupation was that of a farmer. His wife Maria died in 1903, and on December 3rd, 1904, Marcus M. Baird, age 57 of Sturgis, married Mary Perkins, age 37 of Denver, Colorado. On April 24th, 1906, the marriage was legally voided or annulled. As it turns out, Mary was married to another man, James L. Wilson. They married in 1902 in California. In 1905, Marcus learned that his second wife was already married. She left Marcus's home on November 21st and had the law track her and Mr. Wilson down. They found them on the train in Lincoln, Nebraska, headed for Pennsylvania, and were arrested. Marcus and a deputy sheriff from Meade County went down there. She admitted to them that she was married to 2 men and feared that she would go to the penitentiary. Marcus states to the court that he, quote, wants to get a release from thereof any claim on my property. And so the marriage was annulled. In later years, he wrote to the Pension Bureau as follows: requires due care due to the following: dizzy and fainting spells, falls at times, cataract developing in both eyes, eyesight very poor, right foot crippled so that he can hardly walk, urinary trouble. May 24th, 1926, Marcus passed away in Sturgis. According to his obituary, it was one of the largest funerals held here. The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and Klanswomen attending in full regalia and conducted their ritual at the church. A firing squad from the 4th Cavalry at Fort Meade gave the full military honors accorded to an honored soldier of the Republic, one who wore the blue. The casket was covered with the American flag. Comrades N.H. Loop and Samuel C. Weaver of the GAR sat on the platform, and at the grave, the last rites performed were those of the GAR ritual. Interment of the remains was at the Bear Butte Cemetery, the pallbearers being members of the Klan in robes. He was an upright, honored citizen, loyal to his country, and his active life of service was in full evidence to the very end. He took prominent part in all the memorial and patriotic services, and he will be missed by a large circle of friends. Kind of an interesting. Now, this photograph's not the only one that we have in the library of GAR members in Sturgis. While I was doing research, I found this photograph. It's in the Aggie collection, and it's from Memorial Day of 1919. 4 of the men are identified on the picture. We have Samuel C. Weaver. He's listed as Mr. Weaver on the picture. He's not in the other photograph, in this photograph, and he was the last Civil War veteran here in Sturgis. And we have N.H. Loop, Marshall Hughes, and as he's identified on this photograph as David Baird, but comparing the picture to this one, it's Marcus Baird. For some reason, whoever identified him on that picture.
David is his son.
That's his son?
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. Whoever was
wrong.
confused the names.
Yeah.
Who the other 3 are, I don't know. I haven't been able to identify. And so, with that, that's the story of these 8 men.
When did they start doing this?
Lady up here asked, when did they start doing the census every 10 years? 1790 was the first census that was taken. That's
Okay,
something
but
that,
they gave them every 5 years.
5 years were state census. Some states would do them at the 5-year intervals, some states didn't do that. I mentioned with Bailey Madison, 1857, that was a census in Minnesota in 1857. So states could do a census whenever they chose. South Dakota for a while did them every 5 years.
Do you think that was outside the Presbyterian church?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we have another photograph that has all the veterans in 1919, the
Yeah.
7 Civil War veterans, the Spanish-American War veterans, and the World War I veterans. They're all there. And if you go out to the main part of the library, we've got some photographs on the wall, and one of them said, a copy of that photograph showing all of them up there. Anybody else have any questions?
Any Confederates that found their way up here?
Not that I have found here in Sturgis. I do know there are 2 galvanized Yankees in Galena. And a galvanized Yankee was a Confederate soldier that was captured and then switched sides. And there's 2 of them in Galena that I know of.
My great-grandfather was a Confederate soldier. He's buried in Spearfish.
Okay,
And some of the records are hard to find because it was Confederate. And he applied, Confederate soldiers could get a pension at some point. Anyway, he applied and his application was rejected in his application in Spearfish, and I assume because he was in the north, but I have no idea.
well, the difference between the Union soldiers and the Confederate soldiers as far as pension, Union soldiers got a pension from the United States government. Confederate soldiers had to get the pension from their state.
Oh, I see, okay.
So whatever
I just
state it
saw
was that he
It was
served in.
Texas.
Okay, so it would have been the Texas, they would, for whatever reason, decided not to
Okay.
give him. And by 1900, the United States government had decided to give a pension to the Civil War veterans when they applied, for no other reason than they were getting old. If they had any sort of a medical condition, they could apply for a pension. David Comstock's 3rd wife tried to apply for a widow's pension after he died. She was denied because she was not married to him prior to 1905, and his injuries were not related to his military service, even though his complaint was piles of rheumatism. And speaking of pension records, when I was doing the research on David Comstock, I found the pension or the discharge had been canceled due to a fraudulent special order. I ordered his pension records from the National Archives. It turned out to be 194 pages. Oh, yes. Very, very much, very interesting. Because he had to prove that he had served in the war. He had to prove that he was John Donne. He also had to prove that he was not the John Donne that had filed for an earlier pension. So he had to have witnesses stating, yes, I know him, I served with him. So it was quite interesting reading.
My great-grandfather was in a train wreck in Illinois, and he got a pension for the train wreck. And then he married a very young girl, and she still was drawing a pension in her early 30s.
Yep. Yeah, that was not uncommon back in those days, especially right around 1900. You had these older soldiers that were widowers, and you had young women that, okay, they'd marry them for the pension. $6, $8, $12, $15 a month. It was a pretty good pension. And so and some of those, they ended up having children. I was in Michigan in an organization called Sons of Veterans of the Civil War, descendants of Civil War soldiers. And we had, in our camp, we had 2 men whose fathers had fought in the Civil War. Granted, this was about 20 years ago that I was with these guys, but I knew that close of a connection to the Civil War, their fathers. Yeah, I mentioned David Comstock, his 3rd wife. He was born in 1842, and she was born in either 1879 or 1881. I haven't been able to determine which one, but David Comstock was her 2nd husband. Her 1st husband was a widower that had children, and his oldest son was either a year younger or a year older than she was. So. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming and listening to me this afternoon.